Grace's story began in a small, quiet town where the hustle of the outside world felt distant. Yet the pulse of everyday life was ever present. She had grown up in a modest home on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business. The streets were lined with old trees that shaded houses of varying sizes, none particularly grand, but each with its own story. Grace's house was one of the smallest, a simple two-bedroom with peeling white paint and a tin roof that had long since stopped being able to keep the rain out completely. Her grandmother, who had raised her since birth, was a woman of few words but great wisdom. Grace's parents had passed away in a tragic accident when she was just a baby, leaving her with only fleeting memories of their faces and photographs. Her grandmother, Maria, stepped in without hesitation to raise her, embodying a love so fierce it was nearly suffocating. Maria worked as a seamstress, sewing clothes for people in town, and though her work was steady, it hardly paid well. Grace had learned early that money was always tight, but the sense of community and the love between them kept their home full of warmth. Growing up in such an environment shaped Grace in ways she would only fully appreciate much later. She developed a keen sense of responsibility early on, often helping her grandmother with chores and errands. Her world was simple, built on the small acts of kindness from neighbors, the quiet hum of her grandmother's sewing machine, and the shared meals that always seemed to bring people together despite their differences. It was a life that had a rhythm to it, predictable but comforting. Despite their modest lifestyle, Grace dreamed big. Her aspirations were not born from a desire for luxury or wealth, but from a genuine desire to give back to the community. She had seen how many children in her neighborhood struggled, whether because their families lacked the resources to provide for them, or because they didn't have the guidance they needed to succeed. From an early age, Grace had the notion of starting a foundation, one that would support children in her community, offering them the opportunities they needed to break out of the cycle of poverty. But for now, her dream was a distant one, tucked away in the corner of her mind, overshadowed by the need to survive. Grace attended the local high school, where she was well-liked by her classmates and respected by her teachers. Her intelligence and kindness set her apart. She didn't seek attention, but people naturally gravitated toward her. Teachers admired her hardworking attitude and her ability to help her classmates without a second thought. Though she didn't have the best clothes or the latest gadgets, Grace had a quiet dignity about her that made her stand out in a way that felt more lasting than any material possession could. Still, there were moments, especially in her teen years, when she couldn't help but feel the sting of having less than her peers. The other kids would talk about vacations to places she could only dream of, or how they had the latest technology, and Grace would feel an uncomfortable pang in her chest, wondering what it would be like to live with such ease. But Grace's grandmother kept her grounded. Maria was firm, but never harsh. She would say things like, "Grace, don't let anyone tell you that who you are depends on what you have. You are enough as you are. You have your heart, and that's what counts." Maria's words, though simple, shaped Grace's worldview in profound ways. Her grandmother taught her that while material wealth might offer comfort, it was the richness of character that truly defined a person. As she grew older, Grace became more involved in community service, working at the local community center to help children with their schoolwork. There, she saw firsthand the barriers that many of these children faced, much like she had. Her heart ached for them, and she poured herself into the work, organizing after-school programs, tutoring sessions, and weekend events where the children could come together, have fun, and forget about their struggles, if only for a few hours. It was here, in these moments of helping others, that Grace felt most alive. She knew that if she ever had the resources, she would create a space for these kids, a sanctuary where they could learn, grow, and find opportunities they never thought possible. Despite the obstacles, Grace's focus never wavered. She applied for scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and slowly but surely managed to save up enough to go to college. There were times when her resolve faltered, when the weight of her responsibilities seemed too much, but she always pushed through. She never stopped dreaming. Her goal was always clear: to make a difference in the lives of children like the ones she grew up with. She wanted to be the person who helped them build a better future, just as others had helped her along the way. By the time Grace graduated from college with a degree in social work, she had made many connections, and the idea of her foundation was no longer a distant dream. It was something tangible, something she was ready to start building. However, she also realized how challenging it would be to turn that dream into reality. It would require resources, funding, and support, things that still felt far beyond her reach. But that didn't matter. Grace knew that, with time, hard work, and the right people behind her, she could make it happen. It was in this frame of mind that she crossed paths with Edward, though she had no way of knowing how much that encounter would change her life forever. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the charity gala was one of those events where everything seemed to shimmer with elegance. The crystal chandeliers, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of golden light, and the air thick with the buzz of people talking, laughing, and exchanging business cards. Grace had never been one to frequent such high society affairs, but her work at the community center had earned her a spot at this one. It was the kind of event where the rich and influential rubbed elbows with philanthropists and those seeking donations, all pretending to be in the same league. Grace felt a bit out of place, but she was determined not to let her nerves show. She had been invited to represent the local community initiative, and despite the fancy clothes and the intimidating crowd, she was there for a purpose. Her heart, as always, was focused on the children and the community she cared so deeply about. It wasn't the luxury of the venue or the people that mattered. It was the opportunity to network with those who might help make her dream of starting a foundation a reality. She glanced around the room, noticing the familiar faces of local philanthropists and business leaders. Most of them were caught up in their conversations already established in their circles. But then, her eyes landed on someone who didn't fit the usual mold. An older man standing by the window, his profile partially illuminated by the light streaming in from outside. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his tuxedo fitting him perfectly, but there was something about him that set him apart from the others. He wasn't talking to anyone, just quietly observing the event, as though he had better things to do, but was waiting for something. He didn't seem pretentious or eager for attention. Something about him intrigued Grace, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She wasn't here to be distracted by people, no matter how compelling they seemed. She focused on the task at hand, greeting potential donors, explaining the mission of her community center, and leaving with contacts that could lead to the support she desperately needed. But fate, as it often does, has a funny way of unfolding. Grace was just about to start a conversation with a potential donor when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, expecting someone from her team or perhaps a familiar face she hadn't noticed before. Instead, there stood the man by the window, offering a gentle smile that seemed warm and sincere, his blue eyes sparkling with quiet amusement. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and unexpectedly kind. "I couldn't help but overhear you talking about the community center. It sounds like a wonderful cause." Grace was taken aback for a moment, mostly because, unlike the others, he seemed genuinely interested, not just looking for a reason to schmooze. His gaze was steady, not scanning the room or checking his watch as if he was waiting for a better opportunity. He was listening. Grace had learned to tell the difference between someone pretending to care and someone who truly did. This man, though his appearance suggested a world entirely different from hers, seemed like someone who might just understand. "Thank you," Grace said, grateful for the brief pause from the chaos of the gala. "It means a lot. We're trying to provide more resources for underprivileged kids, to give them the opportunities they deserve." Edward, she would later learn his name, nodded thoughtfully, his expression both serious and empathetic. "I can tell you care deeply about this," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I've always admired people who give their all to causes like this." He paused for a moment, then added with a faint smile, "I'm Edward, by the way." Grace introduced herself, her initial hesitation fading as she sensed that, for once, she was talking to someone who wasn't just glancing over her, waiting for their next opportunity. They spoke briefly about the community center and the challenges Grace faced in securing funding. Edward listened with a rapt attention that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected at such an event. "Tell me more about what you envision for the future of the center," he asked, leaning in slightly, as if he genuinely wanted to hear her thoughts. Grace felt a spark of confidence she hadn't realized she'd been lacking. It wasn't just about the gala or networking anymore. It was about sharing her vision, the thing she'd been dreaming of for so long. She told them about the after-school program she wanted to expand, the mentorship initiatives, and the possibility of creating a dedicated space for kids to learn outside of school. Edward's eyes brightened as she spoke. That's the kind of thing the world needs more of. How can I help? Grace, caught off guard, stammered a bit. Well, anything, donations, guidance, advice, connections. I need the right people to see what we're trying to do. He smiled, not offering any grand promises, but making it clear he was genuinely willing to help. I'll have my assistant get in touch with you. Let's talk more about how we can make this happen. As the conversation ended and Grace turned back to the crowd, she felt something she hadn't expected, a quiet sense of hope. There was something about Edward, his unassuming manner, and his genuine interest that made her believe this could be the start of something significant. She hadn't come to the gala looking for an opportunity like this, but sometimes life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. It wasn't just the connection she'd made with Edward that stood out, though. It was the feeling that for once someone saw her for who she was, not as the girl from a small town with big dreams, but as someone who was worthy of their attention, their time, and maybe even their support. The evening continued around her, but Grace walked away with a renewed sense of purpose and a growing hope that maybe, just maybe, this encounter would be the first step toward the future she had always dreamed of. Over the next few weeks, Grace couldn't shake the memory of the conversation she'd had with Edward at the gala. It wasn't just that he was wealthy or influential, but how he had listened, really listened to her. The way his eyes had softened when she spoke about her dreams for the community center made her feel like her aspirations weren't just lofty ideals, but something worth fighting for. After their initial conversation, Edward had followed through, reaching out through his assistant to set up a meeting. That first gesture felt like an opening door, one she hadn't expected to find, but was ready to walk through. Their first meeting outside of the gala was at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It wasn't flashy, but it was quiet, and Grace appreciated that. The low hum of background chatter and the clinking of coffee cups felt far removed from the pretentious spaces Grace was still getting used to. When Edward walked in, he looked every bit the part of a well-heeled businessman. His tailored suit still sharp, even after hours of meetings, and his gray hair neatly combed back. But there was a warmth to him that transcended his polished appearance. He wasn't here to show off his wealth. He was here to talk. Grace, he greeted with a smile, extending his hand. It's good to see you again. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. Grace smiled back, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been a while since someone had truly listened to her, especially someone from a world so different from her own. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed that feeling of being heard. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, they dove straight into the details of the community center. Edward asked pointed questions, ones that didn't feel like he was just trying to be polite, but rather genuinely trying to understand her vision. As Grace spoke, she noticed the way his eyes focused on her, and it was clear that he wasn't just making conversation. He was taking her seriously. There was no air of condescension or dismissal that often came from people who had more power and money than they knew what to do with. Instead, there was a real curiosity, a desire to know not just about the logistics of the center, but what motivated her. I wanted to know why this mattered to her, and that, she realized, was what made this meeting so different. As they continued to meet, their connection deepened. Edward would often suggest new ways to approach things, ideas for raising funds or connecting with people in the business world, but his guidance was never overbearing. He treated Grace as an equal, someone whose opinion mattered, whose voice could carry weight. Grace, in turn, began to open up more. She had always been driven by her desire to help the children in her community, but she hadn't realized until she spoke with Edward just how much that purpose had shaped every aspect of her life. Talking to him made her feel like her dreams could actually take flight, something that had always seemed so impossible in the past. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, something that neither could quite ignore. It wasn't just their shared sense of purpose. It was the way they could talk for hours without realizing the time. It was the way Edward made her laugh, genuinely laugh, in a way that felt both comfortable and new, and how she saw the world in a way that seemed to open up something in him. He seemed to be different around her, less guarded and more authentic. For someone who had spent years building an empire, guarding every detail of his personal life, this was new territory. On a crisp autumn afternoon, just a month after their first meeting, they decided to take a walk through a nearby park. It had become their thing, finding moments to escape the business of their worlds and connect on a human level. They strolled through the park's winding paths, leaves rustling around them as they spoke about everything from their childhoods to their hopes for the future. "I didn't expect this," Grace admitted after a long pause, her gaze directed at the path ahead. "I didn't expect to be talking like this with someone from your world. I mean, I've always believed in what I'm doing, but there are moments, especially when things get hard, where it feels like no one sees it the way I do." Edward stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. "Grace, I've seen what you're doing. More than that, I've seen what it means to you. That's why I'm here." His voice was steady, but filled with an unspoken understanding. Sometimes the hardest part is knowing that the people who really get it aren't the ones you'd expect. Grace smiled at the sincerity in his words, a warmth spreading through her chest. There was an honesty to him that was rare. And for a brief moment, the distance between their worlds felt like nothing more than a matter of circumstance. It was then that she realized how much she was beginning to rely on him, not just for the support of her foundation, but as someone who understood her in a way no one else had. Their walks continued, and with each one, they seemed to drift closer, their conversations becoming more personal, more intimate. There were long silences where neither of them felt the need to speak, simply enjoying the comfort of the other's presence. Grace, who had spent much of her life guarding her emotions, found herself letting down her walls around Edward. He had a way of making her feel safe, a rare gift that made her think about things differently. One evening, after a particularly long meeting about the future of the community center, Edward surprised her. As they parted ways at the door of her apartment, he reached out and gently took her hand. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes, an unspoken promise that things were changing between them. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "there's something about you. I don't quite know what it is yet, but I can't stop thinking about it." Grace looked up at him, her heart unexpectedly racing. "I feel the same way," she admitted quietly. It was in that moment, under the fading light of the evening, that Grace realized this wasn't just a partnership based on mutual respect or a shared goal. There was something more here, and despite all the reasons she had to pull back to keep things professional, a quiet, undeniable truth lingered in the air between them. They were both falling for each other. The path ahead was uncertain, but Grace couldn't help but feel that whatever was unfolding, it was exactly where she was supposed to be. A few months after their first real conversation, Grace found herself in a place she never expected to be. It wasn't just the progress she'd made on her community center or the growing list of potential investors Edward had helped her cultivate. It was the way she felt about him. Over time, the quiet connection between them had blossomed into something deeper, something undeniable. She had grown to admire his wisdom, his kindness, and the way he saw her, not as the girl from a modest background, but as someone capable of changing the world. And somewhere along the way, she realized she had begun to feel something more for him. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the city lights started flickering on in the distance, Edward invited her to dinner. It wasn't unusual for them to share meals together, but this felt different. There was a weight to his invitation that Grace couldn't place. They met at a small, intimate restaurant in the city, away from the public eye. Edward had a way of choosing places that were simple but elegant, where the focus was on the experience, not the setting. As they sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily, as it always did. They spoke about their projects, their hopes for the future, but there was an underlying tension in the air that Grace couldn't ignore. Edward was quieter than usual, and Grace, ever perceptive, picked up on it. She found herself wondering if something was wrong. Suddenly, as their waiter poured wine into their glasses, Edward looked across the table at her, his blue eyes soft but serious. "Grace," he began, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "I've been thinking a lot lately. I've thought about the way my life has changed since meeting you. about how you've made me see things differently, made me believe in things I didn't even know I needed to." Grace blinked, feeling a rush of warmth sweep through her. "Edward, what are you trying to say?" He smiled faintly, a soft laugh escaping him. "I'm trying to say that I've never met anyone like you. You've shown me a kind of courage and conviction I've been missing. I think I've known for a while now, but I wasn't sure how to say it." He paused, his hand resting on the table, fingers lightly brushing against hers. "Grace, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she walked into the restaurant that night, but this declaration took her by surprise. She hadn't anticipated it, not because she didn't care for him, but because she'd never imagined that someone like Edward, with all his success and complexity, would choose her. She took a breath, trying to steady herself. "Edward, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything now," he said gently, his voice sincere. "But I need you to know that I'm asking you to be with me, not because of what I have, but because of who you are. You've changed everything for me." Grace's mind was a whirl of emotions, joy, uncertainty, and a deep sense of gratitude. She had spent so much of her life focused on giving to others, on making a difference in the world, that she hadn't ever really considered someone offering her a place in their life in the same way. But here was Edward, offering her more than she could have ever imagined. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, I'll be with you." Edward's face lit up with the kind of joy Grace had rarely seen on him. He reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture simple but meaningful. The connection between them was no longer just about their shared mission. It had become something much more personal, something deep and profound. But as they left the restaurant that night, a small voice of doubt began to creep into Grace's mind. She had said yes, but the reality of what this relationship would mean, the public scrutiny they would face, and the challenges that lay ahead were not lost on her. She was, after all, a woman from a small town, with big dreams but little to offer in terms of wealth or status. And Edward, as kind and generous as he was, came from a world where appearances and expectations were everything. What would people say? Would they look at her and see only a young woman who had somehow lucked out with a wealthy, older man? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Their relationship blossomed in private, but the moment they stepped into the public eye, Grace felt the weight of judgment bearing down on her. Rumors started to swirl. Friends and acquaintances whispered about the age gap, the difference in their social circles, and the fact that Grace had seemingly stepped into a world she didn't belong to. At first, Grace tried to ignore it. She focused on the work she was doing, on the future she was building. But the whispers grew louder. One evening, a tabloid magazine published a story about their relationship. The headline read, "The Wealthy Widow and the Young Black Woman. A romance or a strategic power move?" The article was full of insinuations, calling into question Grace's motivations and suggesting that Edward was simply using her to bolster his image in the public eye. The comment section was even worse, with people sharing their thoughts on how a woman like Grace could never truly understand Edward's world, and how she must be taking advantage of his generosity. It was hard to ignore the negativity. It stung more than Grace cared to admit. She had always been proud of her roots, of the woman she had become, but suddenly, everything about her, her background, her identity, was being picked apart by strangers who had no idea who she truly was. Edward, ever the protector, reassured her. "Let them talk," he said. "They don't know you the way I do." But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that their judgment was a reflection of something deeper, something more systemic. She was proud of who she was, proud of where she came from, but could she really overcome all the prejudices others held against her? As the pressure mounted, Edward surprised her once more. He made a public statement about their relationship, defending Grace with a level of conviction that both surprised and humbled her. "Grace is the reason I've come to see the world in a new way," he said during an interview. "She's not here for my money or my influence. She's here because she believes in people, in making a difference. I'm proud to stand beside her." The words he spoke were simple, but they were a shield against the harshness of the world. And in that moment, Grace realized that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Together, they could navigate the judgments, the expectations, and the challenges. And maybe, just maybe, their love would become the proof that a connection between two people, no matter their background, their age, or their race, could rise above the limits others tried to place on them. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back life together with Edward felt like a dream for Grace, though at times it was a dream tangled with the threads of reality that could not be ignored. In the months following their engagement, things began to settle into a rhythm. They were no longer just two people from different worlds, but partners, equally invested in each other's lives, dreams, and future. Grace had always been independent, but with Edward, she discovered a kind of togetherness that felt both comforting and exhilarating. They shared everything, the small moments, like long walks after dinner, to the big ones, like the foundation's progress, their conversations about legacy, and the quiet reflections of their pasts. Grace threw herself wholeheartedly into her work with the community center, using Edward's support not just as a lifeline for the project, but as a means to cement the bond between them. She knew that with his backing, the center would thrive, and in turn, so would her own sense of purpose. She hadn't expected the personal changes that came with being in Edward's world, but she embraced them. She learned how to navigate the delicate social circles he moved in, using her charm, compassion, and intelligence to build bridges between people who once seemed unreachable. Her work, both for the children's programs and for Edward's philanthropic endeavors, brought them closer as a couple. It was clear they shared a vision for the future, and together they worked toward that vision. But as their lives together deepened, so too did the undeniable changes in Edward's health. It started subtly. He would tire more easily, his usually steady pace slowed, and his once quick wit became interrupted by moments of forgetfulness. Grace brushed off these signs at first, attributing them to the stress of work, travel, and the pressures of running his empire. But when Edward's normally sharp memory began to slip, forgetting appointments, missing phone calls, repeating stories, Grace knew something was wrong. One night, after they had just finished a late dinner together, Grace noticed Edward's hands trembling as he set his glass down on the table. His face was pale, and his usual easy smile had faded, replaced with a look of fatigue she hadn't seen before. She tried to reach out to him, but he pulled back, brushing it off with a forced chuckle. "It's nothing, Grace. Just a long day. I'm fine, really," he said, but his eyes gave him away. The guarded look that had always been present when he talked about his health had returned, as if he were trying to shield her from the truth. But Grace couldn't ignore the concern that grew in her chest. She insisted he go for a checkup, but Edward, always proud and private, refused. "I'm not getting any younger," he said with a weak smile, "but I'll be fine." But the reality was much different. Edward's decline, though slow, was undeniable. When he finally agreed to see a doctor after Grace's repeated pleas, the diagnosis was clear. Edward had been living with a degenerative disease for months, possibly even longer. It was something that would only get worse over time, with no cure, no way to reverse it. His ability to function, both mentally and physically, would slowly diminish. The news was devastating. For Grace, it felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had known that life with Edward might not be forever, but this diagnosis turned their reality into something fragile, something more finite. It was hard to comprehend. Edward, this strong, commanding man who had built an empire from the ground up, now faced a future he couldn't control. And she, who had always believed in the power of doing good, was helpless to stop what was coming. In the months that followed, Grace stepped into a role she hadn't expected to play: caregiver. It wasn't a title she had ever sought, but it was one she took on with love and determination. She made sure Edward's doctors were always in contact, that his medication was administered on time, and that every possible precaution was taken to ensure his comfort. She adjusted to the new routine, balancing the demands of her foundation, her growing involvement in Edward's business affairs, and the increasing care he needed. But the toll it took on her was immense. She felt herself stretched thin, torn between the woman who had always dedicated herself to making the world better and the woman who now had to care for a man she loved deeply but was slowly losing. She couldn't escape the weight of it all. The constant worry that one day she would wake up and find him unable to recognize her, or that one day he might not be there at all. Edward, despite his declining health, tried to maintain his usual charm. There were still moments when he would make her laugh, when his quick wit would shine through, though it was becoming rarer. But those moments were bittersweet. As much as Grace cherished them, she knew that they were becoming fewer. She would sit beside him at night, holding his hand as they watched the stars, knowing that the time they had left together was running out. "Promise me something, Grace," Edward said one night, his voice hoarse but still filled with conviction. "Promise me you'll keep pushing forward with your work, no matter what happens. Promise me you'll keep fighting for those kids, for the future you want to build. I may not be able to help you in the way I once did, but I want you to remember that I believe in you. I always will." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she looked at him, her heart heavy with love and sorrow. She had always known that Edward's legacy was something she would inherit, but she hadn't anticipated inheriting the weight of his decline as well. Yet, in his words, she found a new resolve. Edward was right. She couldn't stop now. His belief in her, in their shared vision, had always been the driving force in her life. It was the one thing she could hold on to. Over the following months, Grace watched Edward fade, but she also witnessed the deepening of their bond. There were moments of quiet tenderness, moments when the world outside seemed to disappear, and it was just the two of them. Despite the sadness, there was an undeniable beauty in the love they shared, a love that had grown from an unexpected meeting into something profound. And Grace, as the caretaker, became more than just his partner in business. She became his anchor, his reason to keep fighting through the pain, and the one person who saw him not for his wealth or his status, but for who he truly was. Through it all, Grace learned that love wasn't always about the grand gestures or the romantic moments. Sometimes it was simply being there for someone when they needed you most, holding their hand, listening to their fears, and giving them the courage to keep going even when the road ahead was uncertain. The morning Edward passed was a quiet one, unlike anything Grace had imagined. The hospital room was filled with the soft hum of machines, the steady beeping of monitors, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps as nurses came and went. But for Grace, there was a strange stillness in the air. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for this moment to arrive, and now that it had, everything felt suspended in time. She sat by his side, her hand resting gently in his, her heart filled with both grief and a deep sense of peace. Edward, the man who had shown her a life she never thought possible, was gone. She hadn't expected the feeling of finality to hit so quickly, but as the doctor confirmed his passing, Grace realized just how much of her world had been tied to him. Edward had been more than just her partner in love and business. He had been her rock, her guide, and her greatest supporter. Now, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, and she was left with the weight of everything they had built together. The funeral was a quiet affair, the small gathering of friends and family paying their respects in a way that felt fitting for Edward. There were no grand speeches, no lavish displays of mourning, just a small circle of people who understood the man for who he truly was. The service ended, and Grace found herself standing alone by his grave, the cold air biting at her skin, her heart heavy with the loss of the man she had grown to love so deeply. She had spent so much of her time caring for him, for the life they had built together, that it hadn't quite hit her until now. He was truly gone. In the days that followed, Grace tried to gather the pieces of her life back together. The community center, the foundation, the legacy they had both dreamed of, it all felt like a fragile thread now, one that could unravel at any moment. She was surrounded by well-meaning friends, colleagues, and family who offered their condolences, but their words felt hollow in the face of her grief. The emptiness of the house, the silence where once Edward's voice had filled the space, was unbearable. Then came the call from Edward's lawyer. The will was ready to be read, and Grace, as his wife, was expected to be present. A wave of dread washed over her. She hadn't thought much about the will during Edward's illness. They had always talked openly about their plans for the future, and she assumed everything would be fine. But now, Standing at the threshold of this final step, Grace wondered what lay ahead. Would she be left with nothing? Was the life they had built together nothing more than a fleeting dream? Or would Edward, in his usual quiet way, have left her with something unexpected, something more than just the wealth he had amassed? The reading of the will took place in Edward's lawyer's office, a small, dimly lit room filled with bookshelves stacked high with legal documents. The lawyer, a stern man named Mr. Thompson, adjusted his glasses and glanced over at Grace before beginning. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but formal. "Edward left very specific instructions for his estate. He wanted you to hear this in person." Grace nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. The lawyer began reading, his voice monotone and clipped, each word sinking deeper into Grace's chest. The estate was vast, Edward's business holdings stretching across multiple industries, from real estate to charitable foundations. His family, once close, had long been estranged, and the lawyer carefully listed the smaller provisions made for them, gifts that seemed obligatory rather than heartfelt. But it was the next part of the will that caught Grace's attention. "To Grace, my beloved wife, I leave everything," Mr. Thompson read, his voice softening as he continued. "I leave you not only my estate, but also my dreams, my hopes for the future we plan together. You have been my greatest gift, and I know you will carry on the work we began. Please use these resources wisely. You have my complete trust." The words felt surreal. Grace blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to process what she had just heard. Everything, he had said, the house, the business, the investments, everything Edward had worked for, every single piece of the life he had built was now hers. And yet, as she sat there in that cold, sterile room, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a burden. She wasn't just inheriting wealth. She was inheriting the weight of everything Edward had hoped to achieve. The lawyer continued, outlining more details of the estate, but Grace barely heard him. Her mind was focused on the legacy Edward had left behind, not just the tangible assets, but the mission they had shared. The foundation, the community center, these weren't just projects. They were a part of both of them, a testament to the life they had dreamed of building together. Now, it was all on her shoulders. When the lawyer finished reading the will, he looked at her with a level of sympathy. "Edward trusted you completely, Grace," he said softly. "He knew you would honor his wishes and continue the work you started together. The estate is yours, to do with as you see fit." Grace nodded, though she felt far from ready. The responsibility of it all felt too much to bear. What would the world say? Would people believe that she, the woman from a modest background, could possibly know what to do with this vast empire? Would she be seen as someone who had taken advantage of Edward's illness? The doubts gnawed at her as she walked out of the office, the weight of the will settling in her chest. But as the days passed, Grace found clarity. Edward's faith in her, his belief in her strength and ability, was not just a gift, it was a challenge. He had known that she would face resistance, that people would question her worth, but he had left everything to her because he trusted her to see it through. This was her chance to prove that she could carry his legacy forward, not just for herself, but for the children in the community, for the people whose lives they had both hoped to change. Sitting at her desk late one night, Grace opened Edward's letters, the ones he had written during his final days, and she felt a deep sense of resolve. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about continuing the work they had started, about giving life to the dreams they had shared. Edward had left her with more than just a fortune. He had left her with a mission, a chance to make the world a better place in his honor. And as Grace sat there, reading his words, she knew she would do whatever it took to make sure his legacy lived on, no matter how daunting the path ahead seemed. The days following Edward's death and the reading of the will were marked by an overwhelming sense of disbelief. Grace had expected some form of opposition from his estranged family, but she hadn't anticipated the intensity or the venom that came with it. The suddenness of it all left her feeling vulnerable, as though the ground beneath her was shifting, leaving her off balance. It began with a phone call. Grace had just returned to the house after meeting with the lawyer, still reeling from the weight of the inheritance and her new responsibilities. She was preparing to meet with some members of the foundation board when her phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Edward's son, Daniel. Grace. Daniel's voice was tight, barely contained. We need to talk. Grace hadn't heard from Daniel in months, years, actually, except for a few terse emails when Edward was in the hospital. Their relationship had been strained, to put it mildly. Daniel, the eldest of Edward's children, had always been resentful of their father's lack of involvement in his life, and when Grace had come into the picture, that bitterness had only deepened. But now, hearing the anger in his voice, Grace knew something more was at play. "I'm listening," she replied cautiously, bracing herself for whatever was coming next. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Daniel continued, his words sharp, "but I need you to know this. You will not get away with this." Grace's heart sank. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play innocent with me," Daniel sneered. "We all know what this is about. You've been scheming, haven't you? Somehow managed to worm your way into his life, and then take everything from us." There was a pause, and Grace could almost hear him seething through the phone. "You think you could just swoop in and take his empire? You're not even part of this family." The accusation hit Grace harder than she expected, leaving her speechless for a moment. The hurt and the betrayal in his voice were palpable, but so was the deep-seated resentment he harbored. Edward's children had always felt sidelined, and now, with Edward's death, that resentment had found its target in Grace. "I didn't take anything," Grace said finally, her voice steady but firm. "Edward made his choices. He trusted me to carry on his work. This isn't about me. It's about the future we planned together." But Daniel wasn't hearing her. "You've got no right. You don't belong here, Grace. This is our legacy, our birthright, and you're going to regret this." The line went dead before Grace could say anything else. The sting of his words lingered long after the phone call ended, and she sat there, feeling more alone than she had in months. She knew there would be pushback from the family, but the intensity of Daniel's reaction was something else. He didn't just resent her for marrying Edward. He resented that she was now in charge of everything his father had built. The next few days brought even more tension. News of the will had leaked to the press, and the media frenzy surrounding Edward's estate only fueled the fire. Tabloids painted Grace as a gold digger, accusing her of manipulating an elderly man for his wealth. The constant barrage of criticism began to chip away at Grace's composure. It felt like the entire world was turning against her. The phone calls from Daniel became more frequent, filled with venomous accusations. He even enlisted the help of his siblings, Ella and Nathan, to challenge the will, claiming it was invalid and that Grace had somehow coerced their father into leaving everything to her. The pressure was mounting, and the burden of managing the estate while fighting off a legal battle weighed heavily on Grace. She could feel her resolve being tested, the years of hard work and trust that Edward had placed in her now under threat. She hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't expected to be thrust into a war with his children over what was rightfully hers. As Grace prepared for the upcoming legal hearings, she couldn't help but feel the weight of every judgment that had been cast upon her. She knew that, to Edward's children, she was the outsider, someone who had swooped in, taken advantage of their father's failing health, and now stood to benefit from his fortune. They saw her as an intruder, a woman from a humble background who had no place in their world. It was easy to see how they might believe she had manipulated Edward's generosity. But Grace had never asked for any of this. She had loved him truly and deeply, and had been by his side when no one else was. She hadn't married him for his money or his status. She had married him because of the man he was, the man who had always supported her dreams and believed in her. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting meeting with the lawyers, Grace received a visit from Ella, the youngest of Edward's children. She was quieter than her brother, but just as determined. Unlike Daniel, Ella hadn't openly attacked Grace in the press, but the coldness in her eyes when they met spoke volumes. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Ella said, standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "But you've got no idea what you've started. You can't just erase our father's legacy like this." Grace stood tall, despite the exhaustion and the emotional toll it was taking on her. "I'm not erasing anything, Ella. I'm honoring it. I'm doing what Edward asked me to do. You and Daniel may not agree with his choices, But I'm not here to fight with you. I'm here to keep his vision alive." Ella's gaze softened, but there was still a flicker of distrust in her eyes. "It's not that simple, Grace. You've made things personal. Our father made mistakes. He chose you over us, and we're not going to just let that slide." Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "I never asked for this," she said, her voice quieter but no less firm. "I didn't choose to be in this position, but Edward did, and I'm going to honor his wishes, no matter what anyone else thinks." Ella stood there for a moment, her expression conflicted. There was a part of her that seemed to understand, but the pain of years of neglect from their father ran deep. Finally, she turned and left, leaving Grace alone to face the next challenge. As the legal battles raged on, Grace's resolve only grew stronger. She knew she wasn't the one being attacked, but Edward's legacy, and no matter how many accusations were thrown her way, she would fight to protect it. She wasn't doing this for herself, but for Edward, for the future they had envisioned together. And, in the end, Grace knew that if she could make it through this storm, if she could rise above the bitterness and the anger, she would prove that she was more than just Edward's wife. She was the woman who would carry his legacy forward, no matter the cost. In the weeks following Edward's passing, Grace had immersed herself in the overwhelming tasks that came with managing his estate. Meeting with lawyers, sifting through financial documents, handling the mounting pressure from his children, and keeping the foundation afloat. But beneath it all, something else was slowly unraveling. Something Grace hadn't anticipated, something that would shift her entire perspective on the man she had loved and lost. One afternoon, while sorting through Edward's personal belongings in his study, Grace found a small, weathered leather journal tucked beneath a stack of papers. It was a journal she hadn't seen before, one she knew wasn't part of the document she had been given access to during the will reading. Curious, she opened it to the first page. It was written in Edward's neat, meticulous handwriting, a style that was both elegant and precise. The journal wasn't just a collection of random thoughts or musings. It was filled with notes about his philanthropic endeavors, his silent contributions to various causes, and most surprisingly, the extent of his charitable work that had been kept hidden from the public eye. As she read through the pages, Grace felt a mix of awe and disbelief. Edward, the man she had known as a successful, somewhat private businessman, had been quietly supporting numerous causes, donating large sums of money to underprivileged schools, funding healthcare programs for those who couldn't afford treatment, and even helping struggling families with no expectations in return. But none of this had ever made it to the press. None of it had been public knowledge. It was as if Edward had deliberately kept his good deeds shrouded in secrecy. The more she read, the more she began to understand why. Edward's reasons for keeping his contributions hidden weren't born out of pride or arrogance, but out of a deep-rooted humility. He had wanted his help to be about the people he supported, not about recognition or gratitude. Grace found herself marveling at the depth of his empathy, how he had quietly moved through life, changing lives without ever asking for the credit. The magnitude of it all was staggering. Edward had been more than just a wealthy businessman. He had been a man who had spent his life giving, without anyone ever truly knowing. One entry in particular stood out. It was written in the months before his diagnosis, and as Grace read the words, she realized just how much foresight Edward had in everything he did. "I'm leaving something behind," the journal entry read, "but it's not just about the money. It's about the opportunity to make a real difference. I want her to know this. Grace will understand. I know she'll take this further than I ever could. This is my last gift to her." Her heart skipped a beat. It was as if Edward had known, somehow, that this would be her path, that she would be the one to carry forward the legacy he had carefully built. There was something so intimate about these words, so personal. She had always known Edward had a deep belief in her, but reading his thoughts made that belief feel even more tangible. His faith in her was not just based on what she had already done for the community. It was in his belief that she could continue his work on a much larger scale. The foundation, the legacy, the empire he had quietly built, it was all leading to this moment. It was her responsibility now. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his trust settle on her shoulders. She had thought, in the weeks following his death, that the hardest part would be simply managing his estate and keeping his business interests intact. But it was more than that. Edward's journal had unlocked something new for her, something profound. She realized that she wasn't just inheriting his wealth or his name. She was inheriting his vision, his desire to make the world a better place, and his unspoken belief in the power of small acts of kindness. As she continued reading, she uncovered more about Edward's personal regrets, his estranged relationships with his children, his distant connection to his family, and his failure to truly reconcile with those he had wronged. He had made mistakes, no doubt, but he had also sought redemption in the way he lived the last years of his life. Edward's journal wasn't just a testament to his business achievements or his financial success. It was a map of his heart, a record of the lessons he had learned and the legacy he wished to leave behind. There was one final entry that struck Grace deeply. It was dated just a few months before his death, and it was a reflection on his life as a whole. "I've done the best I could," it read, "but I wish I had more time to do more for the people who really need it. I want Grace to know that the foundation isn't just a legacy. It's a movement. She has the power to change things, to lift people up. Don't let this die with me." Grace closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. Edward's words filled her with an overwhelming sense of purpose. She realized now that her role wasn't just to maintain his legacy. It was to expand it, to take it to places he could never have reached. He had left her with more than just a fortune. He had left her with a blueprint for changing the world. This wasn't about charity or handing out money. It was about creating systems, opportunities, and pathways that would allow others to rise, just as she had. But as much as she felt the weight of Edward's trust, she also felt the pressure of what lay ahead. Edward had built his wealth with an iron will and an unshakable belief in himself. But Grace knew that she would need more than just his resources to carry out his vision. She would need to build a team, rally support, and fight through the skepticism that would undoubtedly come her way. The foundation wasn't just about what Edward had started. It was about what she would create from it. That night, after reading the last of Edward's entries, Grace sat in the quiet of his study, staring out the window at the city below. For the first time since his death, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just carrying forward Edward's legacy. She was forging her own. And with that realization came a fierce resolve. She would not let his work go unfinished. She would take everything he had built and expand it, shape it into something even greater. And in doing so, she would honor not only his memory, but the future they had dreamed of together. Building the foundation wasn't an easy task for Grace, but it was the one she had promised Edward she would build. And now, it was the one she was determined to see through. As soon as the will had been read, Grace knew her next steps would be critical. She could feel the weight of the expectations not only from Edward's memory, but from the thousands of lives she hoped to touch. The vision was clear: to create a sanctuary where children from underserved communities could thrive, where they would be given the same opportunities that Grace had once dreamed of. But with the inheritance came the monumental responsibility of turning that vision into reality. Grace knew she had to build a foundation that wasn't just about handing out money or setting up charitable events. She wanted something lasting, an institution that could change lives for generations. But starting a foundation from the ground up required much more than just money. It required careful planning, smart investments, and most importantly, the right people to help bring the vision to life. She wasn't alone in this. Edward had quietly set up a network of advisors and experts who had worked with him on several philanthropic projects, and Grace was now able to tap into that resource. But even with the support of trusted professionals, there were moments when the enormity of the task left her feeling overwhelmed. She spent the first few weeks diving into every aspect of the Foundation's mission, researching other successful initiatives, reaching out to partners, and sitting in countless meetings with lawyers, financial experts, and program directors. It was a blur of legal language and spreadsheets, each more complex than the last. But the heart of it, the part that Edward had always understood, was about building trust. She would need to prove herself to those who might have doubted her abilities. They would need to see her not just as Edward's wife or the woman who had inherited his fortune, but as someone with the vision, passion, and ability to make real change. One of the first hurdles Grace faced was finding a clear direction for the foundation. Edward's wealth was vast, but it wasn't the size of the inheritance that mattered. It was the cause. Grace knew the center of the mission had to be the children, but what would the foundation focus on specifically? Would it be scholarships, after-school programs, mental health support, or something else? She spent sleepless nights reading studies, talking to educators, social workers, and community leaders, all while trying to stay true to the vision she and Edward had shared. After much deliberation, Grace settled on creating a comprehensive program that combined education, mentorship, and community support. The foundation would not just provide resources for children. It would offer them an entire ecosystem of opportunities to grow. There would be scholarships for higher education, tutoring programs for academic support, after-school initiatives to engage kids in creative and vocational fields, and mentorship programs to connect them with professionals who could offer guidance and inspiration. It wasn't just about giving them a leg up. It was about creating a system that would allow them to stand on their own feet, no matter their background. She also focused on building partnerships with local schools, government organizations, and other nonprofits. She didn't want to reinvent the wheel. She wanted to collaborate, amplify, and elevate the work that was already being done. With Edward's extensive network of business contacts and philanthropists, Grace was able to leverage existing relationships and rally support for the initiative. But building the foundation wasn't just about building connections with other organizations. It was about building trust with the community. As the months passed, Grace found herself spending more and more time meeting with families, community leaders, and local activists to ensure the foundation was meeting their needs. She visited schools, attended town hall meetings, and listened to the stories of families who were struggling, just as she had when she was growing up. She learned about the systemic issues that affected children in poverty: lack of access to quality education, inadequate mental health support, and the absence of safe spaces for kids to explore their talents and passions. Every meeting, every conversation, only solidified Grace's commitment to the foundation's cause. She knew there were skeptics who would never believe she could pull it off, people who still saw her as nothing more than a woman who had inherited her wealth. But with every step, she felt herself growing more confident in her role. The foundation was no longer just a way to honor Edward. It was now her mission, her responsibility, and she was determined to see it succeed. In the midst of the planning, Grace had moments where she questioned everything. Some days, the weight of it all felt suffocating. The negative press from Edward's children continued to simmer in the background, and though the legal battles were slowly dying down, the media still painted her as an outsider, a woman who had no place in Edward's world. And though she knew the importance of public opinion, it stung to be seen as anything other than someone who genuinely cared. It was during one of those moments of self-doubt that she received a letter from Edward's lawyer, Mr. Thompson. The letter was brief, but meaningful. It was a personal note from Edward that had been included with the legal documents after his death. In it, Edward simply wrote, "Grace, you are the heart of everything I've built. Don't let anyone, family, friends, or the world, tell you that you're not enough. I've always believed in you, and I know you will make a difference. Do not be afraid to dream big." The letter was a balm for Grace's weary soul. It was a reminder of why she had chosen this path, why she had committed herself to the foundation in the first place. She wasn't doing this to prove anything to anyone. She was doing it because she believed in the vision, because she had seen how a single person's belief in the future could transform a life. Edward had entrusted her with his legacy, but it wasn't just the material wealth. It was the responsibility to make a meaningful impact. With renewed energy and a sense of clarity, Grace pressed forward. She spent months crafting the programs, bringing together a team of experts, and securing the funding necessary to launch the first phase of the Foundation's initiatives. The grand opening was still months away, but Grace had already started to feel the ripple effects of their work. The Foundation was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a living, breathing entity that was already changing lives, even in its infancy. In the quiet moments, when the office had emptied out and the city lights flickered below, Grace would pause and think about Edward. She would picture him, not as a business tycoon or the man who had given her everything, but as the quiet, generous man who had believed in her, who had trusted her to take his dreams and make them her own. And in those moments, she knew she was doing exactly what he had hoped for, not just building a foundation, but building a future for the children who needed it most. The turning point for Grace came when she least expected it, a moment that shook the foundation she had spent so much time and energy building. But ultimately, it was the moment that solidified her belief in what she was doing. She had been working tirelessly on the foundation for months, handling logistics, fine-tuning programs, and managing a growing team. Progress was slow but steady, and while she had the support of many, there were always those who doubted her ability to carry on Edward's legacy. The media, the public, and even Edward's children, especially Daniel, remained skeptical. There were whispers of her being nothing more than a temporary placeholder, someone who didn't truly understand the magnitude of the work. But Grace had kept pushing through the noise. She was determined to prove that she wasn't just the widow of a wealthy man, but a leader in her own right. She could hear the doubts, but she refused to let them cloud her vision. She believed in the work, in the kids the foundation was serving, and in the future they could create together. But then, the announcement of the foundation's first big public event, a gala meant to raise awareness and generate the crucial funding for the next phase, set the stage for an unexpected twist. The night before the gala, Grace stood before the stage in the grand hall where it was all going to happen, overseeing the final preparations. The event had been carefully planned. There would be speeches, live music, and testimonials from community leaders. Grace had invited several major donors, including key members of Edward's network, but also local families whose lives had already been touched by the foundation's work. The evening was meant to be a showcase of what the foundation had accomplished so far and what it could achieve in the future. But as she looked over the room, she felt a rising anxiety that had been creeping up on her for days. She had already received several last-minute cancellations from big donors, and the media coverage had been underwhelming. There was no denying that people were watching, waiting for the foundation to either prove itself or crumble under the weight of its ambitious goals. The stakes were higher than she had anticipated. This wasn't just a gala. It was a test not just of the foundation's potential, but of Grace herself. As the night unfolded, Grace found herself caught in a whirlwind of conversations, handshakes, and flashing cameras. She put on a brave face, smiled, and did her best to make every person feel important. But beneath her polished exterior, she could feel the pressure mounting. This event wasn't just about showcasing the foundation. It was about her place in it. She had to prove she could command a room, inspire confidence, and galvanize support for the work that lay ahead. If the gala failed, if it was deemed a flop, it would be her failure. She would be seen as just another well-meaning widow who couldn't live up to the expectations. Just as the first round of speeches began, Grace was interrupted by one of her assistants, a young woman named Rachel, who came to her with a worried look on her face. "Grace, there's someone here to see you. Someone important." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" "It's Daniel," Rachel said, lowering her voice. "He's outside, and he wants to speak with you privately." A wave of tension washed over Grace. She had been bracing herself for a confrontation with Edward's children, but she hadn't expected it to come tonight, in front of everyone. Still, there was no avoiding it. Grace excused herself from the ongoing speeches and walked to the back of the hall, where Daniel stood waiting, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. "Grace," he said, his voice curt, "I've been hearing the rumors, and I'm sure you're aware that things aren't going as planned. The gala, it's not going to bring in the kind of support you need. People are questioning your ability to handle this." Grace stood her ground, though she could feel her heart racing. "I'm doing everything I can, Daniel. This foundation isn't just about raising money. It's about changing lives. And that takes time. You can't expect it to happen overnight." Daniel scoffed, a bitter edge in his voice. "You think you're the only one who's invested in this? You're standing here talking about how you're going to change things, but the reality is you've never been a part of this world. You're just a figurehead, Grace. They'll see that soon enough." For a brief moment, Grace considered walking away. It would have been easy to let him have the last word, to retreat into the comfort of her team and her supporters. But something inside her clicked, and the flood of doubts and insecurities that had been gnawing at her for months suddenly dissipated. This wasn't just about the gala, or Daniel, or the media. This was about the kids, the communities, and Edward's vision. This was about the legacy they had worked so hard to build together. And she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Daniel, tear it down. She took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "You're wrong, Daniel," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I've been part of this world since the moment I said yes to Edward. I've worked alongside him, supported his vision, and now I'm here, leading it, making it happen. And I'm not going to let anyone tell me I don't belong." Daniel's face softened, just for a second, before he turned away, clearly frustrated. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" "I don't have it all figured out," Grace replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I know what I'm doing, and I know what needs to be done." The kids we're helping don't care about the rumors, the press, or who gets credit. They care about getting the chance to succeed, to build a future. And that's what I'm here to do, no matter what. As she spoke, Grace felt a shift inside her. She had always believed in the work she was doing, but now, with those words spoken aloud, she felt a newfound confidence. This was her path, her responsibility, and no one, no matter their position, could take that from her. As Daniel walked away, the sound of the gala's music and chatter filled the air again. Grace turned back to the room, but she was no longer filled with doubt. She had already begun to see the results of the foundation's work, even if they weren't always immediately visible. And tonight, despite the setbacks, the gala was still a success. Not because of the money it raised, but because it had shown her one undeniable truth. She was capable of leading this foundation, and she was more than ready to take on whatever came next. The turning point had arrived, not with a grand gesture, but in a quiet, decisive moment where Grace realized that her vision, her leadership, and her heart were all aligned. And that was all she needed to succeed. Grace's transformation was not one that happened overnight. It wasn't an instantaneous shift, but a gradual, almost imperceptible unfolding of self-assurance and strength that came with time, with challenges, and with the constant pressure of living up to Edward's legacy. When she had first taken over the foundation, she was unsure of herself, driven by the memory of Edward's trust in her and the overwhelming task that lay ahead. But the deeper she immersed herself in the work, the more she found her voice, and with each passing day, that voice grew louder, more confident, and more authoritative. It wasn't just about managing the foundation or making decisions that would affect thousands of lives. It was about discovering who she was, separate from Edward's shadow, separate from the expectations of others, and even separate from the past she had carried with her for so long. Grace had always known she was capable, but she hadn't truly understood the depth of her own power until she was forced to navigate the weight of the world on her own. The first few months after the turning point at the gala had been an intense whirlwind. The foundation's work was gaining momentum, attracting more donors and partners than ever before, and Grace found herself in more and more high-profile meetings. But with each meeting, each conversation, the doubts that once crept into her mind grew quieter. She was no longer the unsure widow, walking into rooms with her head down, trying to prove she belonged. Instead, she was standing tall, speaking with a clarity and purpose that commanded attention. And as her confidence grew, so did the respect others had for her. One of the biggest changes came when Grace realized she could step into leadership without fear of how she was perceived. She began making decisions with a level of certainty that surprised even her. She had spent so much of her life trying to please everyone, trying to live up to others' expectations of her, that she had forgotten what it was like to act on her own instincts. But now, when faced with a challenge, she learned to trust her gut. Whether it was choosing to invest in a new mentorship program for at-risk youth or deciding to speak out in the press about the foundation's future goals. No longer was she waiting for permission. She was setting the direction. There were times when the pressures mounted, times when the critics, especially from Edward's family, would resurface, questioning her ability to lead or accusing her of taking too many risks with the foundation's funds. But instead of retreating into doubt, Grace found herself standing firm, more resolute than before. In meetings, she spoke less about what they needed to do and more about what they would do with unwavering confidence. She had built this foundation with her heart, with Edward's vision, and with a passion that was undeniable. She knew the work mattered, and that alone gave her the strength to press forward. Her transformation was also reflected in the relationships she built with the people around her. Early on, she had been seen as an outsider in Edward's world and an outsider in the philanthropic community. But as Grace began to find her own voice, she also built bridges to the people who mattered most: the community leaders, the mentors, the educators, the families she was working with. The foundation wasn't just something she had inherited. It was something she had brought to life with her own hands. And through that, she forged bonds that were based on mutual respect and shared vision, not just her connection to Edward's name. But her transformation wasn't just about professional growth. It was deeply personal, too. For years, Grace had lived with the weight of her past, carrying the responsibility of her family's struggles and her own dreams. The sense of inadequacy that had sometimes followed her, especially when people in the high society world would dismiss her as an outsider, had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. She had often questioned whether she truly belonged in Edward's world, whether she could ever live up to his expectations. But now, as she led the foundation through its most successful months yet, Grace finally realized that she wasn't trying to be anyone else. She was simply trying to be herself, someone who had the power to make a difference. One evening, as Grace sat alone in the office, reviewing plans for an upcoming initiative that would provide free vocational training for teenagers in underserved neighborhoods, she paused and looked out the window at the skyline. It was a moment of reflection. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had grown in just a year. She remembered the girl she had been, uncertain, unsure of her place in a world that often felt too big, too overwhelming. But now, as she looked at the blueprint for the future they were building, she realized how much she had changed. It wasn't just the way the world saw her that had shifted. It was the way she saw herself. Grace had learned to embrace her own worth, not just as the widow of a wealthy man, but as a woman who was capable of leading, of creating real change, and of building something lasting. She wasn't just fulfilling Edward's legacy. She was forging her own. And then there were the quiet moments away from the spotlight that cemented her transformation. It was when Grace would sit with the kids at the community center, hearing their stories, their hopes for the future. It was when a young girl, once shy and withdrawn, would come up to her and ask for advice, or when a teenage boy who had participated in the Foundation's mentorship program would share his dreams of becoming a lawyer. These were the moments that reaffirmed why she had taken this on in the first place. The Foundation wasn't just a symbol of her love for Edward. It was a testament to the lives they could touch, to the futures they could shape. Her transformation had never been just about her ability to lead a foundation. It was about understanding that her power, her influence, and her worth weren't tied to her past or her association with Edward. She was her own person, capable of doing incredible things. She had grown into a leader, not because she had inherited a fortune, but because she had the vision, the heart, and the resilience to see it through. Grace's story was no longer defined by the shadow of Edward's legacy, but by the future she was creating. And as she looked toward that future, she knew that she was only just beginning. She had found her place, not in someone else's world, but in her own. And for the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The culmination of Grace's journey came quietly, like the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The community center, now a thriving hub of activity, stood as a testament to everything she had worked for. The programs, the mentorships, the scholarships, the after-school initiatives, all of it brought to life with the resources Edward had left her, but shaped by her vision and hard work. The foundation had become more than just an institution. It was a living, breathing thing, constantly evolving, growing, and changing lives, just as she had always dreamed it would. Grace stood in the atrium of the center, watching as children ran through the hallways, their laughter echoing against the brightly painted walls. There was a sense of energy in the air, something hopeful and alive. For so long, Grace had worked tirelessly, trying to create a space that could change the futures of these children. But now, standing here, she saw it in full bloom. She saw the faces of young students who had never had the chance to dream big, now filled with ambition. She saw the proud parents coming in to watch their children graduate from the mentorship program, knowing that their kids had a chance at something better, something they had never imagined possible. It wasn't just the tangible results that mattered, though. It was the feeling of purpose that washed over her when she thought about everything Edward had entrusted her with. There were moments, especially in the early days, when she wondered if she was enough to carry out his dreams, when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But now, as she watched the kids interacting with their mentors, or when she received letters of thanks from families whose lives had been transformed, she knew. She had done it. She had honored Edward's trust in a way he would have been proud of. But more than that, she had created something that was uniquely hers, a legacy that would live on far beyond her time, far beyond even Edward's. That afternoon, Grace had a meeting with the board of directors and some of her closest advisors. It was a regular meeting, but as always, it was a chance for her to share updates on their current projects and hear feedback. But this time, as she sat at the head of the table, listening to their discussions, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had worked so hard to make this foundation a success, but the truth was it wasn't just about the projects or the numbers. It was about the change they were creating, the future they were shaping. The room grew quiet as the last topic came up for discussion. It was about the future of the foundation. Grace had always known that this day would come, the day when the foundation would have enough momentum to stand on its own. She wasn't needed to hold everything together anymore. The programs were thriving, the staff was fully trained, and the financials were sound. The question was how they could expand, how they could reach more people, how they could continue to build on the foundation's success. Grace, one of the board members, a longtime friend of Edward's, said gently, "You've done something incredible here. But the next step is up to you. What do you see for the future of the foundation? What's the next chapter?" Grace paused, feeling the weight of the question. She had spent so much of her time focused on building the foundation, on honoring Edward's memory, that she hadn't fully considered what her legacy would look like. She had spent years building something for others, but now she realized it was time to think about what she wanted to leave behind, not just for the foundation, but for herself. "I've learned a lot over the past few years." Grace began slowly, her voice steady. "I've learned that a legacy isn't just about the buildings or the programs. It's about the lives you touch. It's about the stories you leave behind." Edward always said that he wanted to make a difference, but more than that, he wanted to show people that they can make a difference too. And that's what I want for this foundation. I want it to be a place where people, young people especially, can learn that they are capable of more than they ever imagined. I want the future of this foundation to be about empowering others to lead, to step up, and to create change in their own communities. There was a pause, and she could see the members of the board exchanging looks. Grace wasn't just talking about expanding programs or increasing funds. She was talking about something deeper, about passing on the torch, about ensuring that the foundation could continue to thrive long after she was gone. "I think," Grace continued, "we're at a turning point. We're ready to start training the next generation of leaders. I want to make sure that, no matter what happens, the foundation stays true to its mission. I want the kids we help today to be the ones running programs for future generations. I want them to know that they can leave their own legacies, just like Edward and I have tried to do." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of her words hung in the air. It was clear that this was the direction they needed to move in. The foundation wasn't just about continuing Edward's work. It was about creating a space where future leaders could rise, where the work of today would be carried forward by the leaders of tomorrow. As the meeting wrapped up and the board members filed out, Grace stayed behind for a moment. She stood by the large windows in the meeting room, looking out at the bustling city below, her thoughts drifting back to where it all began. She thought about her grandmother, about the years of struggle and uncertainty, about the doubt she had carried for so long. She thought about Edward, the man who had believed in her, who had given her the chance to build something lasting. She thought about how far she had come, not just as a leader, but as a person. Grace's transformation had never been just about her ability to lead a foundation or manage an empire. It had always been about something deeper, the understanding that true power came from within, that her worth was not defined by her background or her association with Edward, but by the difference she was making in the world. And as she stood there, looking out at the world she had helped shape, she knew that her legacy, her true legacy, wasn't about the foundation itself. It was about the lives she had touched, the children who now had a brighter future, and the community that had come together to make it all possible. She smiled to herself, knowing that she had finally created the life she had always dreamed of, a life of purpose, a life of love, and most importantly, a life of giving. And in that moment, she realized that this was only the beginning. The future was waiting, and she was ready to lead it. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.